Well, any of you might have raised your hand and mentioned it to me, but evidently I was wrong. I found out about an hour ago. No, you have church tonight. So if you can imagine, like one of those studies that doesn't just pop out of my head. The good news is, I was studying all morning. Just in this is just proof that these studies that I do in the Hebrew Bible are not just for my work. This is what I do for fun. While Molly's upstairs working on a puzzle. So I actually have a story, but I was kind of thinking about starting a new series this week and stuff. I got no new series, man. What I got is another weird story. Could you handle another weird story? This is really one of those weird ones that puzzles me and puzzles other people too. Have you ever noticed? So the title of tonight is Sister Wives. Have you ever noticed the sister wife stories in the Bible? Say which one? Did you know there was more than one sister wife? Where somebody is afraid of the king or afraid of people, and so he says to his wife, either he tells his wife to say, when they ask you who you are, say you're my sister. Or he tells people that and stuff. There's 3 of those stories, and they all seem like they overlap, and my best explanation for that is the old layer thing once again. A lot of times when the stories in the Bible overlap, even in the story of Noah and the ark, or even in creation, it'll tell it once and then it'll back up and it'll tell the whole story again with different words and symbols, and it tells it twice. And you're like, didn't you just tell me this story? Why are we back now and you're telling me the story again? And the best explanation of that, at least for me, is that originally there might have been 2 different versions. So like the northern kingdom might have had a version of Abraham or Noah's Ark, and the southern kingdom had a version, and then when they got joined together, instead of getting rid of one, they just kind of cut and pasted them together and preserved it. So we have kind of it's in stereo, it's stereophonic, right? The other thing that can happen too is a story, and we have this like from the book of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st, 2nd Samuel. After the exile, they wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which if you've ever read those, you know it's a restoring of all the exact same stories. Only sometimes in Chronicles it shortens them up and sometimes it expands it. So we have things in the Chronicles story that weren't in the older stories, and that kind of thing fascinates me. So, I said, last week I was having breakfast and I said, when last time we left off, we were in the stories of Abraham and Lot fleeing from Sodom and Gomorrah, which is Genesis 18 and 19, which has it's mostly southern material, maybe some older stuff, but you go back to chapter 17 and it's all priestly. So if you're kind of new and you don't know what these layers are, the working theory is some of the oldest material in the Bible was from the old northern kingdom. Now the southern kingdom might have been writing stuff too, but there was a lot of stuff before this that were just stories told around the campfire. We know this because the Hebrew language itself that the Old Testament is written in wasn't fully fleshed out until about 1000 BC. And so everything would have either been oral or in another language like Akkadian or something like that. And then when the kingdoms joined together, the southern kingdom, which was the younger brother, so you have all these stories about younger brothers usurping the older brothers, and that's kind of follows along in the big picture theme of Judah becoming the prominent kingdom when the older, bigger northern kingdom became subservient or had to join in with them. And then there's another layer we've almost talked nothing about. Between this and the exile, so the exile happens right here, but around the time of King Josiah, who was Hezekiah's great-grandson, the Bible says that they discovered the book of the law of Moses in the temple. My question is, so what were they doing before that? They discovered this book under the temple, and they read it, and they had a national repentance. And Josiah, in the Bible narrative, became one of the first. I don't know why Hezekiah didn't do this, because he was the king that was famous for protecting all 12 tribes against the Assyrians. Now, Josiah, his contribution was national reform. And so they got rid of their idols. They tore down the altars to Baal. They still had altars up on the Temple Mount to foreign gods. They got rid of all those altars. They smashed down the Asherah poles, and just all across the board, there was this big national revival. And so there's a period of time between that and when Judah is finally conquered by the Babylonians. So we're talking about maybe in the early, Nineveh fell, I think, in 6 something. So right around at the turn of the 6th and 5th century, there was another layer that we've talked almost nothing about. They call it the Deuteronomistic layer. Why they call it that is because the core of it, and this is just a theory, but it's a pretty good one and pretty prevalent, is that the book of the law that they found was the core of the book of Deuteronomy. Not all of it, but the core of it is a law code. That they found that, and based on that, they began to kind of compile some of the histories. And so there's a very well-known scholar that came to the conclusion that the rest of those stories, so throughout 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the book of Joshua, you can see fingerprints of that from the 2 layers before it, but also you can see Deuteronomistic language. So what does Deuteronomistic language stand like? You ever hear this in the book of Judges? And then they did evil in the sight of the Lord, and so he handed them over to the Philistines, who oppressed them for blah, blah, blah. This king did evil in the sight of the Lord. This king did good in the sight of the Lord. This king followed in the evil ways of his father. So the Lord turned him over. There's this cycle. That's the Deuteronomist. The Deuteronomist is the biggest I told you so guy in the whole Bible. So the idea is the reason bad things are happening to you is because you broke the law. And then the Deuteronomist, part of it is before the exile, but even during the exile. And by the way, the Deuteronomist, for me, it might as well be Jeremiah, because that was his role and his. So Isaiah was during the time of King Hezekiah. Jeremiah and Ezekiel maybe as well were the prophets during the fall, during the Babylonian conquest. And you read Ezekiel and you read Jeremiah, and there's just no bones about it. Judah, the reason the Babylonians conquered you is because you had idolatry and you sinned. It's your fault. The exile is your fault. And so we've had almost none of that. There are layers of that in the Pentateuch and the historical books. And then the one afterwards is the priestly one, which we've been in for a couple of Sunday mornings now, that promised restoration after the exile. And like Ezekiel says, I'm going to take out your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And there's a lot of promises in that language about blessings on your descendants. And I'm going to give you the land. It's all out about the land. I'm going to give this land to your descendants, to your seed after you, because that's the audience that's listening to it. And so it isn't just foretelling the future, but you are the seed. All right, so let's read a couple of chapters. And I'm going to take these. You remember my illustration, like which Star Wars was first? It says, depend on what you mean by that. Which one is the earliest in the story, or which one was put out in 1977, right? Because 1977 one is episode 4. So I'm going to take them just in the order that I think they were written. These are three sister wife stories. And I think the reason that there's 3 and they have so many elements in common is there were 3 different traditions of a similar motif about somebody lying that his wife was his sister. And in all 3 of these stories, we're going to walk it through. We're going to look at all 3 of them to just kind of notice, A, what's the same? What's the common thing in it? And 2, what's different? What changed? What is the prophet saying in each one of these? Because they had a different version. So the first one is in Genesis 12. You can barely see that painting. That's actually a painting of. And it's so we're gonna read together the first 2, and then I'm gonna have you look at what I think is the latest one, the priestly one, and just kind of see how it evolved. How did the vocabulary evolve? How did their theology evolve from one to the next? And what can we learn differently from each one? And so here's the story. Up until just this morning, I haven't decided. I think at the moment that it's a southern story. It could be even older. It could be an old northern story or both, all right? So, but there's definitely 3 layers to these. So this one is this. And then Abram journeyed and traveled to the Negev. So a couple of things. You ever notice that the Bible, that at the beginning of his stories, his name is Abram and his wife's name is Sarai? And then, and then it was changed to Abraham, and his wife's name was changed to Sarah. And that change happens in the story in Genesis 17, which is all priestly. So the stitching together of explanation why it changed, that's a priestly story of how it got changed. So what's another explanation is that in 2 different transitions, in one of the traditions, the name was spelt one way, and one of them it was spelt a different way. And it was just a dialect. Just a different dialect. In the north and the south, they pronounced things different. They added an AH to a word where they didn't in the other kingdom. And so scholars that are much more knowledgeable than that can actually notice the difference between the northern and the southern dialect. I mostly just kind of go by the vocabulary words. But when he traveled to the Negev, Negev means south. So if you look at on a map, you have the Sinai Peninsula, if you're familiar with Israel. The whole bottom V-shaped section of Israel is called the Negev. It's the south. And so in this passage, obviously, Judah is right up above it. And so it just says he traveled to the Negev, and they would all know what that is. No further explanation. But there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was great in the land. Oh no, am I going to have to do this every time? And so it was that when they came close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, "Behold now, I know that you are a beautiful woman to look at." Oh, what a great compliment, isn't it? And I highlight that as it says, in all 3, there's a slightly different description of her beauty. So it says she's a beautiful woman, uses that word, and a beautiful woman to look at. And it will be that when the Egyptians see you, and they will say, "This is his wife," and they will kill me, but you they will save alive. So this is one of the Easter eggs. There's a couple that changed my mind from it being a northern story to being a southern story. And this is where that memory game comes in. And this is why I think I need to hurry up and finish this before I forget. But just a couple of weeks ago, you remember the story of Balaam and his donkey? So this sounds just surfacey, but the angel came to kill him on his donkey, and he beat him 3 times. You remember this story? And he says, "Why are you beating that donkey?" He goes, "If it wasn't for that donkey, I would have killed you and left him alive." And he uses the same verbs as in this place. If they see me, they're going to kill me and save you alive. Chaya. It's the word to save we talked about. And so it's just a little, is that concrete? No, just kind of all those things add up. Kill me and save you alive is kind of this word picture that says, all right, those are from the same layer. And we know from other things that the Balaam story is a southern one. So he continues on and he says, "Now, say that you're my sister so that it will be well with me concerning you." That's a difficult passage to translate. So that I'll be okay. "And my soul will live on account of you." And so it was when Abraham came to Egypt that the Egyptians saw his wife and that she was beautiful. Once again, it uses this word beautiful. So I'm just nailing down what are the Easter eggs. This is a southern story. By the way, what is it? Who does he tell to? Who is it that tells everybody she's his wife? She's his sister? He tells her to say it. All right? No, I'm just marking it down. Notice, he tells her in this story. You know, when they ask you, tell them that you're my sister. And then the princes of Pharaoh saw her, and they praised her to Pharaoh. And so his wife was taken to the house of Pharaoh. But it was well with him concerning her. So she was now in the house of Pharaoh, but at least he was okay. Isn't this one of those stories? Is this story okay to anybody? I often think, well, these ancient people were really, really mean. I don't know. If it's not okay to you, I think back in those days, they probably rolled their eyes at it too. There's a point. The idea is, anyway, Abraham did not do the right thing in this story. This is not a story about Abram doing the right thing. We're supposed to pick up a lesson. Anybody help tell me? Be Sunday school teachers for a second. What's the point of this story so far? Always tell the truth, right? Don't throw your wife under the bus. It's better to have your life on the line than to tell a lie and deceive, right? We know this is going to end bad, don't we? Anybody think this is going to end good for Abram? No, it's not. As well, it shouldn't. But it was well with me. And he had sheep and oxen and donkeys and servants and maidservants and donkeys and camels. Anyway, and I don't know why it mentions that he has all of those things, but as long as he's got those, who needs a wife, right? So it wasn't because he thought better of it. He said, but Yahweh plagued Pharaoh. And so here we have it. We've noticed before, Yahweh, if this was an old northern story, it would have said Elohim. And in this case, he says Yahweh. And so this, between that and the kill me and save you alive, this is beginning to sound more like a Yahweh story. He plagued him with great plagues because of Sarai, the wife of Abram. And so Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? And why did you say that she was your sister? And I might have taken her for me for a wife. So now, behold, by the way, taken her is kind of a euphemism. It's a word that is used for to marry somebody. You took her. And so it might be a euphemism also for relations. He said, I might have had wifely relations with her, but he didn't. Why didn't he? He just didn't. He said, I might have. Yeah. And so now, behold, take your wife and go. So Pharaoh commanded his men about him, and he sent him forth, and he and his wife and all that he had. What's the moral of the story? Did we already nail it down? Don't tell a lie. Be honest. Yeah. God looks after you. It's a very simple story, isn't it? Remember, like the rest of them, where I've had to kind of peel away 2 different layers to get down to the old northern story. And in this one, I don't. That's the whole chapter. The whole chapter is whatever source that is. I think it's all one source in that story. And it's the oldest version, the simplest version. And who was the king? The king was the Pharaoh of Egypt. And it was Abram and Sarai. All right. Now we're going to fast forward. And I want to read you what I think is the next iteration. And I think a lot of this is Deuteronomist. Remember that second stage when they found the book of the law? And there's a reason, because there's very much a, if you do these things, you will be blessed. And because of the fact that that they got it right, they restored the blessing, and they almost compromised the blessing. Almost none of that is in this story. Pharaoh just says, what were you even thinking? I almost took her as my wife. And then he says, get out of here with your wife, and that's it. And so now we're going to turn, I call this the green layer. And so you can turn it to it if you want. Chapter 26 begins right in the first verse. It says, now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous one, which was in the days of Abraham. And so by now, by the way, we've gotten past chapter 17. So his name is Abraham and her name is Sarah. And the writer of this story is familiar with the previous story, even though it's how many chapters later? It's 14 chapters later, but that doesn't matter. He's saying this isn't the previous famine, this is the next famine, this is a different one. And yes, we're aware of the other famine story, but I'm going to tell you a new one. And so Isaac went to Abimelech. Now the main character is not Abraham, it's Isaac. And the wife's name is Sarah. So Isaac was Abraham's son. So this is the next generation. So if I'm right, this is being told about the great-grandson, Josiah. And it's a similar story retold with a little bit different flavor and a little bit different agenda to it. And the king of and so Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines of Gerar. So Abimelech shows up in a lot of stories. Nobody knows any history about this king other than his name means my father is the king. Abi means father and king. This is such a basic king. It's hard to tell because he shows up in so many different stories, in different ones in different eras. A lot of people think this is, Tom, like in a movie or in a play, you use a composite character. Like in the movie Dunkirk, there's one general running everything on the mole to get all those people off of the beach. In reality, there were dozens of them. But Kenneth Branagh was the stand-in. You can't. It's too confusing if you've got 12 different generals. So they just have one guy. So Abimelech is kind of he's the bad guy in all of these stories. Plus, nobody knows where Gerar is. We know about all of the other Philistine states. The Philistines were never really a nation. The Philistines, they had, oh man, so many things. That's what happened when in Brazil. Gath and Gaza, and they had like 5 Philistine states, and they didn't all even exist at the same time. But they were all a city with a king, and there wasn't one king over all of the Philistines. They were kind of just a generalized group. And by the time the exile was over, there was no such thing as Philistines. And so this is written during a time when there's still Philistines living on the coast. The Assyrians had ended up wiping out a lot of them, but not all of them. And so, king of the Philistines is kind of a stretch. That one guy was the king of the Philistines. Anyway, and Yahweh appeared to him and said, so this is still in the kingdom of Judah before the exile. So they still use the name Yahweh. But it's just slightly different. And Yahweh appeared to him and said, so how does the vision happen? Yahweh appears to him and speaks to him. There was no, in the older story, Yahweh didn't talk to anybody. Now Yahweh appears to him and speaks to him. He says, you shall not go to Egypt, reside in the land which I will tell you. So this is important because one of the reforms during Josiah's time was that the only proper place to worship was in the temple in Jerusalem. So you remember he says to Abraham, go to a place which I will show you. Take your son Isaac and take him there. And sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. Very much a Judean thing. And then there's just a little bit of an expansion from the priest later on. They said this would be a good time to add back in there all of the blessings for the people after the exile. And so this is all very priestly. If you read Genesis 17, the whole chapter is this language. So it's really obvious that this is, and to your seed I will give this land. So seed is zakar. It means the descendants. And I will fulfill my oath, which I swore to Abraham, your father, and I will multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens. Remember this, and the sands of the seashore. I will multiply you. Go forth and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Those are all priestly things. And then he says, and I will give your seed and I will give to your seed all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed by your seed. And then he says, because Abraham, you have obeyed my voice. So in the original, it just says, and I will be with you, and I will and I will bless you. Because Abraham, you've obeyed my voice and kept my charge and my commands and my statute and my laws. So all of those words, those are very Deuteronomistic things to say. When he says, if you obey my laws and my statutes and my precepts, my commandments, and a lot of times it doesn't just list one, it goes on and on, thinking of every different kind of word for obeying the law of Moses. All of those things. That was very much a Josiah, it's a reform thing to say. And he adds that in. And so in the southern story, God comes to Joshua, and he says, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. It's a promise to the descendants. He says, if you obey my laws and my commands and my precepts. And that's that next layer adding back into the story, which is all important. God wants to bless us, but he also wants us to be obedient. And then the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, "She is my..." Okay. Now, who's the one that says that she's the sister now? Now, it's Isaac, and it's only after the men asked about her. Then he's the one that says, "She is my sister," the same exact word. For he was afraid to say that she was his wife, lest the men of the place kill him. For Rebekah was good to look at. So it's almost the same word, but it doesn't use the word beautiful. In this case, it's just she's good to look at. Which is a good thing to say to your wife, I think. You know, you're pretty good to look at. He goes, and he says, and so it was when he had stayed for a few days. Then Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, leaned out the window and looked. Those are words from the story of David, too. Remember, David leaned out the window and looked? So Abimelech looks out the window. So in this part, this is almost like Shakespeare. It's like Romeo and Juliet, right? In the previous one, it was just the wife had been given up to Pharaoh and stuff, very simple form. Now they have a set. And he leans out the window and looks, you know. So they're close enough to where he can see him outside of his palace. Right? Kind of a cool part of the story. And behold, Isaac was laughing with his wife. I don't know how to translate that word, laughing. You'd say laughing, fooling, goofing around. Is it a euphemism for something? I have no idea. They could have been kissing. They could have been doing something else. They could have been just laughing, goofing. Anyway, whatever they were doing, he could tell they were more than just brother and sister. So I guess you could infer from that they were doing something that was more than just a brother. They weren't just laughing at a joke or something, whatever it was. And so Abimelech called out to Isaac, and he says, "Behold, surely she's your wife. But you did not..." I can't say. I don't know if you can tell. I can't read. I'm in between glasses, and my eyes are still recovering, and I don't want to get new glasses, so I can't see diddly squat. I should have somebody else read it, but I'm almost done. I translated it. I should know what it says. But behold, surely she is your wife. Did not you say that she was your sister? That's what it says. And then Isaac said to him, it was because I said, I will surely die on account of her. But Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might have lain with your wife and would have brought guilt upon us. Now, this is something. So, Pharaoh didn't go into detail about why it was. Well, obviously, we could have taken her as your wife. And in this case, he actually uses the verb, one of my people could have laid with her, and that would have brought guiltiness upon us. So this is a whole new layer, a whole new concept. What I'm kind of pointing out is how their theology evolved. This whole new concept that it's not just the nation, but we would have been guilty because of an impropriety. So this is this idea of sin and guilt now. So whenever I hear this sin and guilt and obedience to the word, all these things, these remind me of the layer that the years of Jeremiah and Josiah added to the Bible. This whole idea of personal responsibility. Then Abimelech charged all of his people, saying, he that touches this man or his wife will surely be put to death. So there's individual accountability. Man, this is getting very theological. So now not only is there guilt for sin, but the individual that sins will be guilty of it and will be put to death. It's not just the whole nation. And then Isaac sowed in that land, and he received that year 100-fold, and Yahweh blessed him. End of the story. Kind of ends kind of nice, don't you think? So what got added in this story? Buddy? Another sister wife story. The phrase, she is my wife. Ishtihi, that's what it means. She's my wife. Anybody? So what's added is sinfulness, guilt, punishment for the sin, and according to the Deuteronomist, if you obey God's laws and precepts and statutes, you'll be blessed. When you plant in your garden, it's going to grow. If you don't, the opposite is going to happen. And so that's it. The message of the Deuteronomist over and over and over, you can hear it in the Bible. It's so clear. The Deuteronomist has not heard about being saved by grace yet. That's going to be a later revelation. But the Deuteronomist is bad things happen to bad people. The Deuteronomist is the one behind the logic of all of Job's friends. Who being innocent has ever suffered? They blame Job for it, right? The book of Job is a response to the Deuteronomist. The book of Job is like during the exile when he's saying, okay, if you're right, then how come good people suffer too? So the first stage of the gospel is if you do the right thing, good things happen. If you do bad things happen, right? And it's true most of the time. Then the hard part is, but what about when bad things happen to good people? That's a more complex thought for a later season. The Deuteronomist didn't think like that. His math was more simple. You know, the reason his garden grew, is there any reason? His garden grew 100-fold. Why? Because he obeyed the precepts and the laws, and that's it. And so it gave him a lot to wrestle with. You want to hear the latest, the third one? If you've got a Bible, this is where we're going to pause, and I'm going to let you read it. So now here's where I'm going to hit the time warp machine, and I'm going to go back to Genesis 20. You say, wait, Genesis 20, we're going backwards now. I know. Because the book of Genesis was not put in order by the priests after the exile, was not put in order according to when it was written. It was put into order in how it fits in the story chronologically. Does that make sense? Just like the Star Wars sagas. They're all out of order. And, you know, some are in the 2000s, some are, you all follow me on this? It was put back into order so that it could be one story. So the very first story is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Starts with creation through Noah and all this. So Genesis 20 is the one. By the way, it follows up. Chapter 18 and 19 was what we read last time we were together about Lot and his family getting out of the destruction that those three angels came to bring, right? And so, if I'm correct, most of this chapter is priestly. And so now here, you just heard two versions of the story, slightly different. Listen for as many different Easter eggs or vocabularies or points of theology that are different than the other two. If you don't have a Bible, there are some under your Bible, but let's just silently by yourself read Genesis 20 and see how many different Easter eggs that you can find of vocabulary that changed. And what does it have in common with the other two? All right. What do you think? Did you notice some similarities? What's the similarities? Yeah, she's my sister. Oh, there's an added, isn't it? There's an added one. Comes back in. So let me just ask you this. Okay, think of this, right? These aren't just newspaper articles, and they're not just written to be historical records. They're prophetic stories. So the storyteller is trying to prophesy to you about something. Why would it be important for a new fact to appear that in point of fact she is my half-sister? Why is that important? What was the moral of the first one, Tom?
Be honest.
Be honest. And so now it's saying, you know what? What if she was actually his half-sister? Then they could kind of both be true. Then Abraham isn't at the end as a liar. So this is the latest. This is post-exile, right before the whole thing gets finalized. What if we gave Abraham a break in that story and said, well, okay, it's not completely a lie that she's my sister. She's kind of my sister and my wife. What do you buy it? I don't know. That way he's only telling half a lie, right? I don't know. It's like when Ben tries to explain to Luke, why did you lie to me and tell me that my father was killed by Darth Vader? And he goes, well, he became Darth Vader, so in a sense, he did kind of kill your father from a certain point of view. What a bogus explanation that is. Yeah, if you don't know what words mean. So yeah, in this case, yeah, from a certain point of view, Abraham didn't lie. Okay. And so, because the third storyteller has a different message he's trying to preach to you, right? The first one is much simpler, was just don't lie. And this one is a little more complex. Steve, what'd you get?
Well, the statement said, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother.
Yeah.
It's like he's going to do this over and over and over again.
Yeah, okay, there's another thing. Listen, yeah, this is how you show my love to her. So you're saying, we love each other. We're husband and wife, but you've always kind of called me your brother. Yeah. Kind of just massaging the story a little bit. So I think this is the third one, even though they're out of order. This is the most developed, right? It's kind of the most developed theology and the most developed version of the story. It doesn't really say there's anything wrong with the other ones, but it's just a third one. Any other differences that you hear?
It does seem like I should quit introducing Faye as my sister.
Yeah. Stop telling people your wife is your sister. Yeah. By the way, couple anchors in all three. She's my sister. Occurs in all three of these stories. She's my sister. Yeah, she really is. Yeah, no. The other common thing is it's a king that's involved. In the first case, it's a pharaoh, but interesting, isn't it? And this is kind of strange. It sounds more like, is it possible that a father and a son can make the same exact mistake with a king of Gerar named Abimelech? Like the dad had never told him. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. That could happen. If you need it to be that way, one of the explanations people say, well, maybe it was his son named Abimelech, and that was just kind of a family name. Okay. So I'm just putting it to you logically. Or does it seem more likely that there's three layers to the story? To me, the layer thing makes more sense, and I don't have to try to hammer out the differences. I actually like to find the differences. I look for them. I don't. In the English, by the way, what they'll do is they'll try to smooth out all of those things and sand them all down so that you don't notice the difference. But I kind of like the difference. Anybody else?
Well, this time he had more of an explanation how God stopped him.
Oh, man. The story of how God stopped him and stuff. And by the way, did you notice who stops him? All throughout this story, it's not Yahweh that shows up, it's Elohim, it's God. And he shows up to him and he speaks to him through a vision, through a dream. In the second story, Yahweh spoke to him. In this story, Elohim speaks to him in a dream. So that's kind of later. It reminds me of like the Daniel stories where he has the dream, which is all post-exile and from that Persian era. So one of the things we kind of are getting a picture is that dreams were kind of more of a thing after the exile, that maybe that was kind of more of a common thought in Persia or in Babylon. Yeah, Donna? I like how it is very much more developed. The whole idea of sin and atonement and forgiveness and payment. And so, okay, here's where I'm admitting my lack of preparation. I only got partway through this and then just said, I just got to go. And Abraham journeyed from there to the land of the Negev. And so now, so this seems to me, this third layer is aware of the other two. Does that make sense? It's built on, if my layer theory is right, the other two aren't aware of this story, but this one is aware of both of the other two traditions and almost combines them. So it's still the king of Gerar, but in this case, it doesn't mention that they're Philistines. It's just the king of Gerar, so he's the king of a city. And it says that Abraham travels to, in the first version, he travels to the Negev. This is the land of the Negev. So in this layer, the audience may not be familiar with that term, so he's reintroducing it to them. There used to be, back in the old days, a place called the Negev, and Abraham went there. And so he sojourned in Gerar, and then Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And so Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. There's that word again. That word took means like to take as your wife. And then you got to wonder, in this version of the story, unlike the other two, you wonder until he explains it just a second, so how far did that go? And then God came to Abraham in a dream in the night. So his name is Elohim now. In both the northern stories and in the priestly stories, they used the name Elohim more. They tended to shy away from the name Yahweh. Not that there was anything wrong with it, but even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have when they would write that name, they would write it in the ancient script. And he said to him, "Behold, you are dead." I like that part. "Behold, you're toast. You are dead meat because of the wife which you have taken, for she is the wife of a master, with a master." And Abimelech had not come near her, but Abimelech had not come near her. And then he said, "Lord, will you slay a righteous nation? For he did not say to me, 'She is my sister.' And she also said, 'He is my brother. With upright heart and innocent hands, I have done this.'" There's an old priestly psalm. "Who can ascend the hill of the Lord? He who has a pure heart and innocent hands." And so this is a very priestly. Remember, after the exile, the kings weren't in charge, the priests were. So the Levitical priests who put the whole story back together, there's a real emphasis on personal holiness and righteousness. And so this story isn't just about lying, and it's not just about, like in the second story, now it's about personal righteousness and redemption. So it's just even more developed. He said, "Lord," oh, and by the way, so in this case, the Lord's going to say, "Yeah, I know you didn't touch her because I didn't let you touch her," right? But first he says, "You're dead because of this." He kind of confronts him, and then it gives him an opportunity to intercede. So this is strange. Abimelech, who's a Philistine king, you wouldn't think, this is not a God-fearer. The Philistines did not worship the same God. They did not worship Yahweh. So now we have a Philistine king interceding, just like Abraham interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah. "Lord, if there's 50 righteous people, would you save it for that? If there's 40 righteous people," he said, even if there's 40, they couldn't even find 5 righteous people. So this is this intercession. Moses does the same thing. Those are all kind of priestly things. Translation, should always be praying for your people. Always be praying. And then God said to him in a dream, also in a dream, "I also know that with upright heart you did this, and I've also prevented you from sinning against me." So in none of the other 2 stories we have the verb sinning. So now we have another theme about sin. We had guilt in the previous one, but not sin. And that is why I did not allow you to touch her. So now return the wife of the man, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. And so several vocabularies that weren't anywhere in the other story. So prophet, I would write down. Pray. So now we have the idea of prayer and being a prophet, and sin and being upright. This might even be my next message on Sunday morning. It'll be hopefully more entertaining than when we do the long math study on Wednesday night. But tamim, upright. He says to Abraham, he says, I am Yahweh your God, walk before me and be upright. Oh, beautiful. Do I have any more? Yeah. But this is, Tom, you want to read it? Oh, it should be if. Sorry. But if you do not return her, know that you will surely die, and you and all that is yours. And so Abimelech rose up early in the morning and called together all of his servants and spoke to them all of these words in their ears, and they were very afraid. And so in the first one, Pharaoh calls together all of his men and tells them, don't touch him. In the second one, Abimelech talks to all of the people. And in this one, Abimelech talks to his servants. There's no difference. That's just three things. When you're reading the same story over again, and the same thing is told a little different, and there's different vocabulary that aren't shared between them, this is where I come to, I think that there's layers. And Abimelech called to Abraham and said, what have you done? How have I sinned against you that you have brought upon me and upon my kingdom such a great sin? Deeds which you should not do, you have done to me. And so here's this idea of this great sin. And then he does something very strange, and I don't think I have any of the other translated. What comes next, Tom?
Oh, it's when he starts blessing him with all the blessings of his house.
Oh, what does he say? What are we in, 20?
Yes.
Good.
Verse 11.
My land is before you.
Oh, yeah. Abraham said, then Abimelech brought, in verse 14, brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah, his wife. And Abimelech said, my land is before you. Live wherever you like. To Sarah, he said, I am giving to your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. And then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves so that they could bear children again. And the Lord had kept all of the women of Abimelech's house from conceiving because of Abraham's wife, Sarah. So here's a couple of big Easter eggs. Money. There's no such thing as money in the world before the exile. It only shows up after the exile. If you ever read a verse where there's a shekel is just a piece of silver, but we know this historically. The people who invented money were the Persians. So the very first piece of money, which was, they had silver and gold that you could weigh, but they didn't have coins. They didn't have pieces of silver that you could say there's 1,000 shekels. By the way, the money in Israel today is the shekel. That's what it's called. I was a trip the first time I went to an ATM and got shekels. It was awesome. But anyway, they didn't have money. The Persian derrick was the very first coin ever invented. And so whenever you read in an Old Testament story that they gave so many shekels or that they exchanged money, that's an anachronism. So that's a more recent telling of an old story, right? Because there's money involved. By the way, did you ever notice that Jesus never has any money on him? Interesting. He never does. And so even during Jesus' time, which would have been now, 400 years later, the idea that Israelites were using money was still kind of, to loyalists to the old Hebrew Bible, it was kind of a further sign that they'd been conquered. They were using a foreign thing, that it was never, that the very reason that they had money. And, even worse than that, the Roman money had the head of the emperor on it and inscriptions that said he was a god and all this kind of stuff. So, Jesus never had money. He goes to tell them the illustration. They said, should we pay taxes? And he says, all right, somebody give me a shekel. Who's got a shekel? Yeah, because he never had any in his pocket. And he goes into the temple and turns over the money changers table because it's just,
Judas, the handler of the money of the group?
yeah, Judas, for 30 shekels, for 30 pieces of silver, right? And that comes from the book of Jeremiah. So it was an exilic thing. So there's something even in the fact that he got sold out for money. It's really in his day. Just like I know, not so much anymore, but I knew maybe 20, 30 years ago, guys that always paid cash and never used a credit card. I don't know if you can exist like that anymore, but there are people that had a really hard time going to plastic. It just wasn't, I don't know, wasn't a manly thing to do or whatever, or they didn't trust it or whatever. In the time of the Bible, all money was like that. And so that's a little bit of an Easter egg. And what I love is there is this idea at the end of it that isn't in the first two stories, even though those two are beautiful too, is that he came, this is Abimelech, this is the king of Gerar, this is a Philistine king. Well, okay, at least he's a Philistine king in the second version. In the third one, it just says he's the king of that city. He doesn't say he's Philistine. So maybe Gerar was still around and but here this king not only rebukes Abraham, but he pays 1,000 pieces of, that's a lot, pays 1,000 shekels. And he says, with this, you are redeemed, you're exonerated. That's the word I use. You're exonerated. He paid the price. He redeemed her. And so here is the transition in the Hebrew Bible. First, don't lie. The second version of the story is, if you do the right thing, good things will happen. You'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll die. That's the Deuteronomist. After the exile, there was this beautiful whole new layer to the Bible. And also, even sometimes when you have done the wrong thing, there's a payment that can redeem you. You can be bought back. You can be redeemed. You can be forgiven. You can be made whole. And so that was the message that leads us up to the cross, that, even when you have messed up, there's forgiveness and there's grace. Isn't it cool? Some cool things you never thought you'd see in these weird sister wife stories, right? There's a show called Sister Wives. That's why I called it that. We call it the Wife Sisters. Any other questions, thoughts, observations? Don't call your wife your sister.
Can you imagine if every time you...
Even though biblically she is, don't call her that.
Here, take my sister.
The story, even the first time, is a ridiculous story. And I like the fact, I think even in the third version, it tries to cut Abraham a little bit of a break and say, well, maybe they were in point of fact. Does that make it better that they're half sister? I don't think it does. I think it makes it worse. Just leave it alone. It's okay. But there are some beautiful things regarding sin and redemption and all of that happen in that third layer. And so I think they're all beautiful, right? Somebody asked me the other day, when you're thinking about this, don't people use these kind of discrepancies to discredit the Bible? And I said, I don't know what people do, but I know not for me. I kind of dissect the salad like this. I put the tomatoes over here and the onions up. It's kind of weird. I used to take my sister's dolls apart to see what was making them talk. I have to know these things. And so when I read these weird stories, I just spend a lot of time thinking about it. And I'm so grateful that my devotional habit this morning was trying to unsolve these puzzles. Because then an hour ago, Molly says, you've got Wednesday night tonight. I said, I guess I know what I'm talking about. All right, you guys. Well, I'm going to wrap it up there, unless you have any other questions or thoughts. And yeah, Lord Jesus, tonight I just thank you for your word, Lord. Even these old stories, they have something to tell us. And I love too, Lord, watching how your people over the centuries grew and learned, how they evolved and matured in their understanding of you, because we've all had that same journey. We all once had a very childish understanding of you, and then we've learned and we've grown, and then through trauma and experience, we've had to relearn it again. And so I thank you, Lord, for allowing us to just see a little bit of that journey in your people. And we just thank you for your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Lord bless you. Thanks for coming, guys.